We're delighted to host Maya Kornberg, Senior Research Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, to discuss her new book, Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress.
The fan club.
I'm Annie Campbell-Washington, Senior Assistant Dean of Academic Programs and Dean of Students at the Goldman School of Public Policy here at UC Berkeley. Tonight's conversation is part of the Goldman School's Democracy Book Club, a series highlighting authors whose work deepens our understanding of democracy by exploring the institutions, policies, and civic traditions that shape public life. We are also grateful to our partners at the Edley Center on Law and Democracy for co-sponsoring this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce our interviewer, Catherine E. Lehman, and the inaugural Executive Director of the Edley Center. The center works to defend and strengthen democratic institutions in the United States through actionable research and public leadership. Under Catherine's leadership, the Edley Center has hosted numerous high-profile panels, tracked the democratic impacts of legislation, and conducted invaluable research, publishing papers that advance and strengthen democracy. Catherine has had a distinguished career in public service. She previously chaired the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, served as Deputy Assistant to former President Biden for Racial Justice and Equity, and held the role of Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, a career that has shaped civil rights policy at the federal level. Catherine's experience spans the nonprofit sector and the highest levels of government. And now I'm honored to introduce our guest, Maya Kornberg. Maya Kornberg is a researcher, teacher, and activist. She holds a BA from Stanford University, an MPA from Columbia University, and a PhD in politics from Oxford University. At the Brennan Center, she leads work on legislative reform, government capacity, and political violence. Her career has spanned nonprofits, international organizations, think tanks, and academia, including roles with the Interparliamentary Union, the United Nations Development Program, NYU GovLab, and Public Agenda. Most recently, she led research for a UNDP and IPU project examining civic engagement in the work of over 80 parliaments worldwide and served as the lead author of the resulting Global Parliamentary Report. Maya has also taught political science at NYU, Georgetown University, and American University. Her commentary has appeared in outlets including The Washington Post, NPR, BBC Scientific American, Slate, and her work has been cited widely across major media. It's a pleasure to have you both with us. Please join me in welcoming Maya Kornberg and Catherine E. Lehman.
Well, thank you to our dean. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight. And I just am going to point to the book, which also is out for purchase and signature, if folks would like. But Maya, thank you for writing this timely and important book. And I'm really looking forward to conversation with you about it for this book club. Let's jump in. I will say that your book raises a question that I think so many Americans are thinking about now, which is, why is our Congress not acting? And I desperately want you to answer that question. So I look forward to that. But I want to share, in case not everybody has read the book yet, an example that you have in the book that just made me want to howl, "Where is Congress now?" which was your reference to a time in 1992 when Congress passed a measure that said that President George H.W. Bush executive order would not have any legal effect, that's the quote from Congress measure, because it was just an executive order and not a duly enacted law. And I think about the many nonsense executive orders that we see from this president now. And I know as a lawyer, they have no legal effect. It's not the same thing as Congress passing a law, and I want to know why more people don't know that, why our Congress isn't passing that measure today, and I would like you to answer that question.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for being in conversation with me again. Thank you so much for having me here and for joining tonight. I wrote the book because I'm also frustrated with that question. The book is titled Stuck because I think that our democracy feels so stuck, I think, that to so many of us. And so it is an attempt to look backward in order to chart a course forward, to understand how we got here. And it documents 50 years of reform efforts in Congress and shows how the mounting forces of political violence and of relentless campaign fundraising pressures and money distorting politics and the distortive lens of social media have made it so much harder for Congress to make change today. And so to your point, I think that the example of executive orders just speaks to a much broader question that the book takes on, which is this kind of push and pull between congressional power and presidential power. There is what we know the Constitution grants Congress the authority to do, and there is, as you're saying, what we know is legal to do, and then there is what actually ends up happening in our government. And so, for example, power of the purse is a power that the Constitution grants Congress. Congress has appropriating power, and yet we're seeing a president who has shuttered federal agencies, who has taken back funds that have already been disbursed to places like New York City, and in so many ways been defying power of the purse. We've seen very recently an example of defiance of war powers, where the Congress has the right to declare war, and yet has not declared war in several decades. And we see presidents kind of slowly grabbing these powers, and the book talks about this, and then President Trump really accelerating this ferociously when it comes to presidential power. And so one of the many things that the book kind of talks about is the way in which Congress has been ceding its power. And again, these are just two examples. It's ceding its power to the executive. And so if we want it to stand up, we need to seriously think about how it got here and how we can be resourcing and retooling Congress to have the strength that it needs to stand up. Because I think as we all would agree, it is more urgent than ever to have a check on the president. It is more urgent than ever to unstick Congress.
Right. And just to situate us, I think you're really right to point out that what we see in this presidency now is more lawless and more naked about the executive power grab, but not unique in our history. I mean, it was certainly memorable when President Obama talked about having a phone and a pen because Congress wasn't sending him laws that he could work with. And I think we have lost something to have this long expectation of Congress not actually enacting laws and sending them to our presidents to veto or not.
Right, with that, and I mean also just the kind of, recently there was a Supreme Court decision, the Loper-Bright decision, yes. That made it harder for Congress. For many decades, there was just a situation in which Congress would be able to punt to executive agencies to sort out the specifics of different policy areas. When that was overturned and what's known as Chevron deference ended, Congress now has to legislate with more specificity and can't. So again, Congress has just gotten too used to not having to sort out the specifics, not having to stand up. There was a system that allowed it to do that. I think right now it needs to figure out how to stand up, especially in light of what's going on and especially in light of things like the Loper-Bright Supreme Court decision from a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's certainly right that Congress needs to figure out how to actually do its job. So that would be nice. But the Loper-Bright decision raises a different problem. Also, I mean, I ran civil rights enforcement under two presidents, and that meant that it was our job, delegated to us from Congress, to evaluate what the very broad principles that Congress wrote in statutes that say, for example, no person shall experience discrimination based on race or sex or disability. And what does that mean in this specific instantiations? And I think it's frankly impossible for Congress to write a statute that gets to that level of granularity. So that's a different problem following Loper-Bright also. What is the space that now Congress will figure out moving forward? Yeah,
and I think that to your point, I don't think it is possible for Congress to catch up. Also, just in terms of the amount of kind of personnel and expertise that executive agencies have, but it has certainly been not doing itself any favors, kind of self-lobotomizing itself for the past few decades. It shocks people to hear that Congress today has several thousand fewer staff members than it did a few decades ago. It has gutted in the 90s an entire congressional support agency called the Office of Technology Assessment that used to help Congress understand science was defunded completely. I would think that might be helpful to them today to have an agency helping them understand science. So, they're not doing themselves any favors. Right. And again, I think that the executive and Congress, as you're pointing out, they occupy these distinct spaces, and they should, and Congress is not going to catch up to the executive in terms of the expertise, but it certainly can do more than it's doing now.
Right.
And it can certainly be investing in dramatically increasing staffing and expertise and other things that it so dramatically needs.
Your book does a painfully beautiful job of talking to us as readers about times in the recent past, in the 1960s, 1970s, when you point out it was quite common for members of Congress to vote across party lines, to come up with compromise, to create legislation that would work for the country. And you painfully describe how Republican members of Congress post-Watergate went to President Nixon to say he lost the confidence of members of Congress and to encourage him to resign. I wonder if you have a view about what it would take to see members of Congress operating with party over party, country over party now.
So I don't think there's a silver bullet, because there is so much that has created the hyper-polarized reality that we have. But we do know that there are some things that could help us in terms of partisan polarization. One of them is that until the 90s, members of Congress used to live in Washington, D.C. That might seem unimportant, but it actually meant that their kids went to the same schools. They got to socialize. They got to just, kind of have these organic relationships. Now in Congress, there's almost no space for members to meet each other. So in the most recent congressional orientation, for the first time, they had for new members like a room where you could just hang out and have snacks with members of the other party. But of course, no one hung out in that room because, there's a lot to do. That's not the way that you are going to build friendships. But what I do hear from members when I speak to them is how frequently they strike deals like at the gym, at the congressional gym, or, just getting to know each other, away from the cameras that are encouraging the polarization, away from the kind of spectacle that we see on television. There was one committee recently in Congress that started to do something that, again, might seem trivial, but was actually really important. They seated Republicans next to Democrats. Mm-hmm. It was like a Republican was seated next to a Democrat, was seated next to a Republican. Now, that's different from normal committee hearings where you have normally one party is seated on one side of the room and the other party is seated on the other side of the room. And again, this is just the way that people get to know each other when you're sitting next to someone. So things like that aren't going to solve the crisis and the gridlock, but they certainly can help. And I think that we can be encouraging just humanity and social interaction between members, because Congress is designed to be an institution that relies both on compromise and also on relationship building. The book talks about in so many ways how successful reformers throughout the ages were reformers who knew that they needed to build relationships with people, both across the aisle and within their own party, and that's still true.
So you raised two things that really stuck out for me in the book when you talk about that. One was the cost pressure on the actual members of Congress themselves to have to maintain two households in very different parts of the country often for people, and what that means for them and their ability to focus on policy as distinct from focusing on fundraising. So I'd love for you to raise that also, and then I'll get to my second question on this too.
Yeah, so the book makes the perhaps unpopular suggestion that we need to raise congressional salaries. And part of the reason, I'm glad that there's support for that here, because it's very unpopular with voters, but the reason why I think that is important, Congress has not received a raise in 15 years, or members of Congress, and right now you have a situation in which, again, since the 90s, members are maintaining or under increasing pressure to maintain two residences, especially in an expensive city like DC. And if you want a system in which not only the wealthy can afford to serve, not to mention, which I'd love to talk more about, the cost of just even campaigning and getting there, right, but even just, maintaining the lifestyle of being a member of Congress, if you want a system in which you don't have to be independently wealthy or, trade stocks with non-public information, then you need to be raising congressional salaries and making sure that, that people can afford to do the job and not only the wealthy can afford to serve. Because increasingly that is a problem. And in the book, there's a quote from a member who says that he knows over 100 members of Congress who are sleeping in their offices because they just are barely in DC because of the pressure to be in the district and fundraise, and they can't afford to even bunk with other members and kind of live in these shared homes. So it's not a situation that I think that we should accept as kind of the status quo for our lawmakers.
Yeah. And then you were talking about having people sit next to each other, and one of the recommendations you make in the book is that there be bipartisan training for new members of Congress so that they can get to know each other and develop those relationships. And I was really struck by a story that you included in the book about then new member Derek Kilmer, and something that a member from the Edley party said to him when they were talking. So I hope you'll share that. I have the quote if it's not right at the top of mind for you, and then talk about whether you think that what that means for how possible it is to have bipartisan relationship building now.
Yeah, so this is a story from Derek Kilmer, who came to Congress, and he was just kind of at some kind of dinner. And struck up a conversation with a member from the other party. He was a Democrat. He was speaking to a Republican. And he said that he wanted to work together, to continue to be in touch. And then the other member said to him that he was not elected to work with Derek Kilmer. That is not why he came to Congress. And that is not why his voters sent him there. And so the incentive, the point is the incentive is to, at least for the cameras, to show that you're not cozying up to Democrats. I recently had a conversation with a congressional staffer who told me that there were two members who he did not want me to name publicly, who we would know in the news. You would know their names, and they're pretty diametrically opposed in terms of their policy ideologies, and they actually hang out. Like they get along, but they're not allowed to say that. I'm not even allowed to say that, and that's the point. That's the problem. When the incentive structure is to play up kind of the most theatrical, most salacious part of your job for the cameras, then that's not encouraging bipartisanship. There's another example that I give in the book of Republican Representative Joe Wilson screaming, "You lie," in the middle of Barack Obama's address to the 2009 joint session of Congress. And that clip went viral. That clip helped him fundraise. When your incentive is to create viral moments for social media, and that can also help you fundraise and you're under increasing pressure to fundraise, then, viral moments tend to be kind of dramatic, salacious moments, not just two people having a burger together and being friends. That's not going to get as much clickbait.
Yeah. You also share some really interesting stories in the book about ways that members have innovated over time to try to unstick their moments and to find ways to move Congress. And I was particularly struck by the example that you offer about Henry Waxman and the fundraising he did to help move within his party. So I hope you'll share that and then talk to us about what it means for what innovation is still possible.
Yeah. So the example of him with the leadership packs and fundraising, I think, is also an example that I give to show something else, which is how one Supreme Court decision, in this case the 1976 Buckley v. Vallejo decision, can have ripple effects that completely change the way in which politics works in America, and the ways in which pathways to power are structured in government. So Henry Waxman comes to Congress in 1974. He is one of the Watergate babies, as they're known, who are elected with the increasing frustration with the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, creating widespread frustration with government and with political corruption. And they come to Congress. It's a group of over 90 new members, kind of set on cleaning things up on fixing all of the dysfunction. 1976, the Buckley v. Vallejo Supreme Court decision rules that spending limits are unconstitutional and money starts to flood campaigns. Now, at this time, Henry Waxman and many of the other new members are young, new members. They're ambitious. They want to get to committee leadership positions. Now, he understands he represented for 40 years Beverly Hills. That's a wealthy and pretty safe district for him. He did not face many primary challenges. And he knew that in this new landscape in which money was flooding campaigns, other members who he would need their support to rise to committee leadership, that they needed more money to fund their campaigns. So he started what's called a leadership PAC. And a leadership PAC was a committee that allowed him to give more money to other members than he could from his campaign committee. And he understood that it would help him curry favor with folks. And indeed, he ended up winning a committee leadership position at a relatively early stage in his career. And now, fast forward 50 years later, almost every member of the House has a leadership PAC where they literally give money to other members in order to build clout, in order to build relationships in the chamber. We also now have a system where, because of Buckley v. Vallejo and then fast forward to the 2010 Citizens United decision, that allows unlimited outside spending into campaigns. We now have a system. Where it's become even more pronounced, and members now have to pay dues to the party in order to get a party leadership position or get onto that powerful committee or get a committee leadership position. Sometimes millions of dollars to the party that they have to pay to get ahead within the chamber. And I think that is just a shocking situation that we should not accept, because this is something that is not only distorting, and I think we read about this in the headlines all the time, who's getting to office, right? Campaign costs, just the costs of winning elected office, but it's also shaping what they're able to do even once they're elected. There's a story in the book of Marcia Fudge, who's a representative who represented a largely working class district in the Cleveland area, who said that she didn't know how she was going to leverage her constituency to pay dues to the party. Not to win re-election, to just pay dues to the party in order to, get ahead within the chamber. So certainly Henry Waxman was savvy to understand how to navigate the current system, but the incentive structure right now, if you want to navigate the current system, is just completely off. It's incentivizing members to just pay to play. And to buy their way onto committees, and that is certainly not a democracy that I think that is functioning in the way that it should.
Right, certainly not our aspirational democracy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So speaking of, your book also details over and over ways that Congress has repeatedly over time not welcomed members who change its existing composition, and I want to walk through some truly painful examples, this first of which I'm never going to unsee in my mind, and so I do not thank you for that. But that was that in 1977, when there were 18 women in the House of Representatives, women were not allowed to swim in the chamber's pool because some men, members of Congress, preferred to swim naked. Thank you for not giving us that information. And then also you say that until the 1990s, there were no women's bathrooms for senators, and female senators had to use the visitor restrooms. And you note that the 104th Congress, from 1995 to 1997, abolished the Women's Caucus, the other legislative support organizations, and stripped them of their offices and their staff. And then, for the current Congress, you flag the current member, Lateefah Simon, who describes herself as the only disabled person in her legislative class, was approved for an office that is accessible by people living with disabilities. But that means that so many of the other offices are not so accessible in 2026. So you've highlighted a history and a present of a Congress that is not welcoming to whom we used to have in Congress exclusively, and the kinds of hurdles that people have had to and do have to overcome to fully participate. And talk to us about what that means for inclusive multiracial democracy ideals and what that means for a Congress that is able to be responsive to all of us who are not there in those halls.
Yeah, so as you're saying, when we saw kind of increasing numbers of women, of people of color, of young people, of so many groups that were underrepresented in Congress coming to Congress, it was not an institution that was built for them. Right. It was an institution that they had to change. The way that I see American institutions and American politics, so much racism and xenophobia and misogyny is baked into our institutions in so many ways, and I think that the process of changing that is not one that happens in a day. But to your point, when members when Congress starts to become increasingly diverse, in the 70s and the 80s, and increasingly things like caucuses, like the Women's Caucus, like the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, and there's so many others, allow members to build community and advocate together for changes to processes internal and external. I spoke to several current and former members of the Women's Caucus, for example, including the co-founder of the caucus, Liz Holtzman. And they told me that the caucus was there both to our point about bipartisanship, both to kind of advocate for issues that matter to members of that caucus, legislative issues, like family, welfare, and other things, and to provide a space for members who are getting to Congress, and I talk about this in the book, who have almost no onboarding when they get there, no handholding, no support, which is especially daunting when you reach an institution where no one else looks like you and where so many of the processes seem to be built and stacked against you, to provide support to new members and to advocate for changes. So I heard so many stories of the ways in which the caucuses kind of provide that mentorship. That's true for the CBC, that's true for the Women's Caucus, that's true for, I think, several of the other caucuses in Congress. And that kind of space, I think, is particularly important when it comes to changing an institution, and those kinds of relationships with older members. So I tell the story in the book of Lauren Underwood coming in. She was part of the class of 2018, which Politico called younger, bluer, and more diverse than ever. This was a class with record numbers of women, of people of color, of young people, and she cared a lot about Black maternal health after experiencing the loss of her friend, Shalon Irving, who died just several weeks after giving birth. And she wanted to start the Black Maternal Health Caucus, and so she knew to team up with Alma Adams, an older member who could help her and together, I think, push forward the agenda that she came to Congress to carry out. And she stood on the steps at the news conference when they announced the Black Maternal Health Caucus and said, "I'm here as I'm the only young Black woman who's ever stood here, and that's why I'm here doing this." And so I think that kind of speaks to the importance of the mentorship and of these caucuses and of organizations that are helping members to carry out that vision. And it speaks to the importance of electing members who bring different lived experience to Congress. Yeah. That quote from her really sticks with me still today. She's there because she is the person with that lived experience who's coming and actually changing policy priorities. That's why we need to elect people who represent the American public. That's why descriptive representation matters.
Yeah, her quote really stuck with me too. I'll read it so you all have it. You quote her saying, "I think that American people assume that Congress works on the issues that are most important for our country. No, Congress works on the issues that its members raise. And if you do not have a Congress that reflects the lived experience of the American people, their issues don't get raised." Yeah. I just thought that was so powerful for us, and, as we think about, where are we going. You also have a lot of expertise in political violence, and you've referenced it a little bit here. I think it's such a tough issue, but I think we need to talk about it. And one of the things that I thought was so powerful in your book is the ways that you lay out, your words are American political violence is as old as the country itself. And you give truly awful examples of political violence over time, while also noting that its prevalence is on the rise now. Just to give a couple, you cite a state house speaker taking out a Bowie knife and killing a fellow member, which is, as stark as it gets. A bomb planted in the men's restroom in the U.S. Senate in 1973. Gangs at polling places to terrorize immigrant voters in 1857, right? And and you don't mention it, but we know from the Smithsonian and our own history the many examples of Black Americans killed for exercising the right to vote. So we have many ugly, recent and less recent iterations of political violence, and you distill why it matters that the violence that impacts legislative work by weakening civic engagement and diluting lawmaking, our legislators are afraid to make statements and to legislate. So if you'll amplify, talk to us about what it means that we live with that political violence now and how we get ourselves out of it.
Certainly. So as you're saying, I certainly don't conceptualize political violence as something that is new in American democracy. I do think, though, that it is manifesting in different ways. So the book talks about the ways in which social media is a new vector for abuse for members, how as Congress is becoming increasingly diverse, political violence, which has always been gendered and racialized in this country, is manifesting in different ways in Congress. And certainly we've seen changes to gun ownership patterns and legislation as an aggravating factor. And so this is affecting lawmaking, the book argues, in three major ways. It's actually distorting the lawmaking process. First, members told me when I spoke to them that they're afraid to do events, to engage with constituents. Representative Scanlon, who I quote in the book, said that she has what happened to Gabby Giffords in the back of her mind. She's referencing the 2011 shooting of Gabby Giffords, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, at a Congress at Your Corner event. Representative Scanlon told me that that's in the back of her mind when she does a civic engagement event. How could it not be? And we just recently saw Representative Ilhan Omar attacked at a town hall. One member told me that there's parts of her own district that she does not go to because she does not feel safe. How can you represent people if you cannot actually be in the district, in your community, hearing what matters to them? Secondly, as you noted, members are saying that they're afraid to take on hot-button issues, to speak out on issues. And this is not unique to Congress. I co-authored a study with colleagues at the Brennan Center where we looked at violence in state and local, violence faced by state and local office holders. And I vividly remember a state lawmaker telling me that she did not take on gun control as an issue, even though it mattered to her, but she did not take it on when her sons were young because she was afraid for their safety. Now, similarly, there's examples of this in the American Congress. There's a quote in the book from Liz Cheney saying that she has had Republican members of Congress come to her and say, I would have voted to impeach the president, but I was afraid for my safety and the safety of my family, which is a shocking statement to sit with, that members cannot vote their conscience because they're afraid for the safety of their families. So this is really worrisome. And then lastly, violence is dissuading members from remaining in Congress. I mean, how wouldn't it? Between violence and then the relentless pressure to fundraise, we're seeing a wave of retirements right now. And it's also dissuading people from running for office or from remaining in office and running for re-election or for higher office. In the study that I mentioned that we did on violence faced by state and local office holders, among local office holders that we surveyed, we found that among women, about half said that they were dissuaded to run for re-election or for higher office because of violence. There's a quote in the book from Nancy Pelosi saying that when she talks to young, dynamic people thinking of running for Congress, especially women, they tell her that what happened to Paul Pelosi, the violent attack on her husband in their San Francisco home, that's their greatest fear, that's the reason that they're not running. How could that not be front of mind for people? And so I think in terms of the ramifications of violence, we need to think about the way in which it's affecting the issues members take on and the way they engage with constituents, but also all of the talent that we're losing out on when violence is dissuading people from running. And again, the disparate impacts that has on women, on people of color, on groups that are already underrepresented in halls of power.
Yeah, and our national responses to it too, right? I think that's really right. I have a bunch of questions I want to ask, but so does our audience. So, so I want to share with you some of the questions that we've gotten. One is, which reforms seem the most realistic at this point, even in the short term?
So the book outlines a number of reforms that Congress can take to kind of unstick itself. Firstly, some of this is just a matter of Congress getting its own house in order. Congress can decide to refund the Office of Technology Assessment. It can decide that members can hire, they have a cap on the number of staff that each member can hire. That cap hasn't changed since 1975. That cap can be lifted. We can be investing in committee structures, in expert staff, in more nonpartisan expert staff, which so many other legislatures around the world have. Congress can be investing in itself, and it needs to, if it's going to have the independent expertise that it needs in order to conduct effective oversight. So that, I think, is a really important fix. Campaign finance reform, it may not happen tomorrow, but ending Citizens United, instituting small donor public financing and other things that we know equalize the playing field for groups with less access to wealth in America who are running, that has happened in cities and states. I believe that can happen. I believe that we can curb the influence of outside money in politics, and that we need to, yesterday, in terms of the way in which it's hurting Congress. I didn't get a chance to talk about this all that much, but the distortion of social media, which I talk about in the book, is something that we need to take on. And part of the reason that Congress has been so incapable, I would argue, of regulating social media is that it hasn't reorganized its committee jurisdiction since the 1970s. It doesn't have a tech committee. It doesn't actually have a group of people responsible for regulating tech in the same way that it does the agricultural sector or any other sector of the American economy. So again, just getting its own house in order and things like reorganizing committees and things like that, I think matter tremendously and don't require anything besides internal changes and internal pressure for things to finally change in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. Specifically, are there reforms that could reduce political extremism, or is that beyond Congress's reach?
So there are certainly reforms that Congress has recently instituted to keep members safer. So for the first time ever after the tragic assassinations of 2 Minnesota state lawmakers and of political activist Charlie Kirk, Congress started giving members security stipends. They've recently changed nationally campaign finance law to make it, and regulations to make it easier for members to use campaign funds for security for them and their families. This is a preventative measure. It's not ending the issue of political violence, but it can help keep members safer and less afraid of doing campaign events and going out and engaging with constituents. And recently, even today, I saw a headline that members are spending more and more campaign funds on security, which again also speaks to the gravity of political violence. But one of the things that the book encourages folks to do, it's a book called Stuck, so I'm not arguing that everything is perfect, obviously. But I think that we cannot just give up on Congress. The vast majority of the American public, if you look at polling, does not support political violence, wants campaign finance reform, wants these things to change. So I think in order to change them, members of the public, we need to be showing up at town halls. We need to be showing up at field hearings. We need to be encouraging members to enact changes that we already know can help and engaging with Congress in a way that can help make things better. So I think that some of the answers are already there when it comes to fighting back against extremism. And we just need to turn out and engage rather than disengaging.
So one of our audience members asked a version of the question I think you just answered, but just to say in case you want to amplify, is at what point does being stuck become a feature rather than a bug of the system?
Mm-hmm. So as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about Congress in historical perspective, I draw a lot of hope from the fact that Congress is malleable. Mm-hmm. It is always a changeable institution. I think it's a lot more changeable and less ossified than people realize. And it's been stuck before. And a lot of the things that we're contending with now that, that I spoke about at the beginning, things like, power grabs of power of the purse. Well, Nixon impounded $50 billion in the 70s. War powers, as I mentioned, Trump is not the first president to try to grab more war powers. So we can learn from history in terms of what has helped to unstick Congress. That gives me a lot of hope, and certainly as we're sitting here just months away from another midterm election, the other thing that gives me hope is that if we look at moments in time when Congress unstuck itself, there's two moments when I think that is most possible. And one of the kind of catalyzing effects that can cause Congress to unstick itself is a wave of new members coming in. Like we had in 1974 after Watergate, like we had in 1994 and in 2018. These wave elections can shake up a system and can change policy priorities and can change the way that deeply entrenched power structures are operating within Congress. And so we might have that again in November. And if we do, I think we should all be thinking about the day after the election. Mm-hmm. How the people that we elect can yet again fix the system. The other moment in time, historically, when Congress can unstick itself, is when the president is abusing executive power. 1946, Congress passed the Legislative Reorganization Act after FDR, in Congress's mind, overstepped during World War II in terms of presidential power. I'm not saying that that's exactly the same as what's happening now, of course, but a president overstepping, the kind of urgency of the public frustration and anger over a system that isn't working, a wave of new people coming into government, these are all things that we know have caused Congress to spring into action and unstick itself in the past. And so it is malleable. It has unstuck itself before, and I think that there is no reason to believe that it can't do that again.
So I hear to that, and I also want to highlight the agency that you describe in the book that each of us has also to unstick our Congress and to help move and protect and sustain our democracy. Just to quote you, back to you, you say, Americans can take action today to make our legislative branch and our democracy work better. We can engage with members by attending town halls or other events. We can support members as they take on politically risky proposals, and we can speak out against rising political violence and other nefarious forces endangering our democracy. I mean, I love that. That is essentially the mantra of the Edley Center on Law Democracy, which I now run, and so I want you to say more about it to us as an audience. But certainly our daily work at my Democracy Center is to equip democracy defenders to know what our guardrails are, to remember to use them, and to remember our agency. And our view is that the reason we as a country are living the speediest democracy decline of any prior democracy in the world is that we are not using the guardrails that we have and that we are complicit in our own democracy decline. So I want you to tell us more about what you want us to do and why it matters. Speak.
Well, there's so many things I think that we can do. And firstly, I just want to highlight what I said earlier, which is that Congress is, among the different institutions of democracy, I would argue perhaps the most unpopular, if not one of the most unpopular. And in writing a book called Stuck about Congress, what I don't want people to take away from it again is that we should just disengage from Congress. I think that Congress is stuck, obviously, for all of these reasons, and so it is more urgent than ever to engage with it. When I talk to people, out or at events or at other things, I hear so much disillusionment, so much, why does it even matter to engage? Because no one's listening to me. And why does it even matter? And so I'm just going to pull away from Congress, pull away from our democratic institutions. And that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing now. And so as you're saying, I think that there are a lot of ways that members can engage, both ones that you listed. I think just showing up at town halls, I've been at town halls, they're not that well attended, and certainly not by a kind of a representative group in terms of what people believe. Congress is having more field hearings. They were having online hearings. There are other ways to engage, to call congressional offices, and ahead of an election, not just to turn out and vote, which is important, but to be educating other people about voting, about how to engage with their representatives. We see so much misinformation online about voting, about the importance of engagement. Some of it intentionally meant to prevent people from engaging. And so being someone who is a source of not just encouragement for other people to engage in our democracy, which is, again, as you were saying, our one salvation, I think, is for people to show up, not just at marches and at protests, but also to show up at events and engage with members and vote and educate people about how to vote and how to, to join your community board or whatever it is locally. That, I think, is the antidote, and we know that from examples of democracies around the world, that kind of civic trust and civic norms is so important. And that's where I feel like also, understanding that that your member of Congress is there, and we need to figure out how to get them the tools and the resources that they need rather than just complaining about it, really comes into play.
I want to underscore it and ask you to say a little more about this point that it matters to reach out to your member, and it matters to show up at your town hall. It matters to talk. They're listening, right? And I mean, you have a particular window with your expertise, with having come to write this book, but all of your work, frankly, about why that members care when somebody asks them a question, when somebody calls their office. Say that so that the rest of us who don't have the expertise you have know that doing that kind of work matters for our democracy.
Oh, yeah, it matters tremendously. I mean, I spend a lot of my time, again, both for researching the book and for my work, talking to members of Congress, legislators. At the end of the day, they are, especially in the House, always running for re-election. And they want people's support, and they know that in order to win that support, they need to be engaging on issues that matter to their community. And I think that there's so many examples of the way in which members, are not just following kind of larger public opinion polls, but also, individual stories of constituents coming to them with certain issues. And recently, actually, Congress, for the first time, is now doing something that it never did before, where members can see if there's overlap in constituent requests between their offices and actually collaborate on them in order to be more effective. So they want to be responsive to constituent requests. They want to be reelected. At the end of the day, and so they need your voice, and they care what you think, and especially I think when people are showing up and sharing why an issue matters to them.
Yep. Okay, going back to audience questions. What surprised you most when doing research for this book and talking to lawmakers and staff?
Well, I'll answer that, and I also just thought of another anecdote, I think, that speaks to the question that you just asked, which is that when I was speaking to members of Congress and I asked them for another piece of research that I did, tell me about a witness who came to testify at a hearing that stuck out to you. Almost every single one of them told me a story about a witness who came to tell their personal story. A WNBA player who was raised on food stamps, was coming to share about why food stamps matter. Or a journalist who was held in captivity was coming to share about the importance of the issues that they were reporting on. So just to add a little bit more to what I was saying earlier, not just the kind of overall issues and people showing up, but also people's personal stories, and on a human level, they stick with members of Congress. The fact that every single one of them told me that kind of story, and I was interviewing dozens of members for that project, I think speaks to the way in which personal stories matter. And to your point about what I found most surprising, I think that members want to share their stories. Frequently I'm asked, how did I get people to sit down with me? But for a very unpopular institution, and when members are constantly berated at town halls, they actually want to tell you what's going on and what they're working on. And I was, I think, inspired and heartened by the care and commitment that members have, and by the way in which they want to share. They want to share learnings. They want to share what they're doing and how hard they're working for their constituents. And that's true for members, and that's true for staff. We have this image, I think, of Congress that people don't want to engage, that it's an opaque institution. Right. But actually, it's really close. If you just reach out a hand and just write an email, I think that there's a lot of people who want to talk and who are there and want to engage and tell their story. And so for an institution that seems so opaque and far removed, I think I was surprised by actually how approachable so many of the members were.
So our next question is, feeling pretty bleak these days, what gives you hope about Congress and our democracy? And maybe that's how approachable they are.
A lot of things give me hope about our democracy. One of them, I think, is first of all, as I mentioned before, the fact that we're sitting here ahead of a midterm election, and that elections, it's a cycle in our democracy. There is always hope to elect a new group of people who can change the institution dramatically, as they did before, and the book talks about that. I also draw hope from the many different people who are working in Congress and outside of Congress to fix things. We mentioned Derek Kilmer earlier, the member who had a burger with a Republican who didn't want to be his friend as much as Derek Kilmer wanted to. It was an unrequited friendship request. But Derek Kilmer ended up chairing something called the Modernization Committee in the House, and that committee did things like, for the first time, create an IT office for Congress. Congress didn't have an IT office until a few years ago. For the first time, create a centralized HR hub. Things that seem obvious to us, but because Congress is so backwards, they're not there. There's these small fixes that don't make the headlines, because again, the news tends towards the most salacious, often the most negative story about Congress. But they're there, they're happening. They're not a silver bullet. They're not going to fix all of the brokenness tomorrow. But you know what? Congress functions a whole lot better now that it has an IT office. And Congress is functioning a whole lot better now that some of these processes have been fixed. And so these changes are happening, and the many different people who are working behind the scenes to do things that, again, you don't always see in the headlines. I'm sure that most people here didn't hear about the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress creating an IT office. That gives me hope.
Yeah, and just to stay with the Derek Kilmer example, when I chaired the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights during the first Trump administration, he was a frequent requester of the commission that we answered questions that he wasn't seeing Congress answer. And then he also held hearings and briefings so that the kinds of information that we were reporting on had an audience with members, and that became bipartisan. And it was, really impressive, I thought, to be pushing other avenues, even when legislation didn't seem like it was going to happen. So I think he was finding ways to use lots of levers too. So.
Yeah, to find windows when doors are closed.
Right.
I think there's a lot of examples of that in Congress today.
Right. Okay, our next audience question is there any group with heft to do a pro-democracy Project 2027 or 2029 with a clear agenda ready to go? And can this be done within the Democratic Party? We would like your
Yeah, I wish I had an answer. I will say that I am inspired and honored every day to work at the Brennan Center, which is an organization that is a nonpartisan organization, which is fighting for the future of our democracy and kind of thinking through blueprints in so many ways. I mean, even with the upcoming elections, I have friends and colleagues right now doing tabletop exercises with secretaries of state and election workers about different scenarios. Organizing groups so that law enforcement can be in conversation with election workers and prepare for the day of. So many different, pushes from everything from criminal justice to making Congress work better. And I think groups, we're not alone. We work in coalition with the Edley Center, with so many other organizations who are working together in the kind of incremental and slow and daily grind to think about the big and small fixes that we can set in place for our democracy. So I don't think there's one organization working on it, but I think that there is a whole huge community that is galvanized. And I was marching in the No Kings protest just a few weeks ago in San Francisco and moved by just the size of these protests, the way in which they span ages and states and different demographics. So there is a movement and there are organizations and we know from looking at democracy and democratic backsliding examples across the world that that's how we fight it.
Right.
And that's happening.
Right. And just to, applause for that, yes. And just to say it, because I think maybe you can't sing the praises of the Brennan Center as much as I can, but that it is really worth taking a look at the policy papers that the Brennan Center shares on their website and the template that they are offering for all of us for what's happening now, what can be done, and I really appreciate that, and I think that when you call it the daily grind, it's the work always that needs to be done. And then for this questioner, the Democratic Party does have Project 2029 that is so named and can be found that way, and whatever you think about the existence of a particular party as the location for that planning, there are also several other entities that are creating their own Project 2029 policy papers, and Brennan Center doesn't call it that, but that's what their white papers are as well, so thank you for them too. All right, so this is back to a new question. Can you talk a bit more about the impact of the demise of the strong committee system?
So that question kind of speaks to something which is universal in legislatures, which is that we know that the power of parties in legislatures as an organizing group and the power of committees is inversely correlated. One tends to gain power when the other loses power. What we've seen in the last few decades in Congress as a result of some of the changes in the 1970s that I talk about in the book, and then the changes in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich, and it's just accelerated, is power becoming increasingly centralized in parties and in party leaders, and committees becoming disempowered in many ways. And I won't get into all the ways in which that ended up happening, but the end result is that instead of the Schoolhouse Rock version of how a bill becomes a law that we all know, of a bill being introduced and then sent to committee, and then there's a deliberation and everyone talks. Yeah, exactly. And everyone does a dance, and then you take a vote. That's not the way that it's happening right now. In many instances, you have a small group of party leaders, sometimes with the help of some lobbyists, writing legislation, pushing it down very quickly for a vote. And there's, instances that I've heard of recently of members not even having time to read a bill before they have to vote on it, let alone, have a whole deliberative process. And so when we think about, again, empowering the people that we're electing in November, you don't have a lot of power to enact change when rank and file members don't have power to weigh in on legislation. Committees were a more decentralized way of allocating power within the chamber. When power is so centralized in party leadership, you have rank and file members, and then especially new members, freshman members, just pretty disempowered when it comes to actual legislative power to move forward an agenda. And so I think that the ramifications for our democracy are pretty bleak when it comes to all the work that we're doing to go out and canvass and vote for and elect people who matter. We need to make sure that they actually have power to drive their legislative agenda when they get to Congress.
Right. Okay. Could you say more about how much time members spend fundraising and posting on social media?
So just to give an example that I think speaks to the point, one member that I spoke to told me that he spends every mealtime dialing for dollars. Wow. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because that is the only way that he can find time to do his job and raise all the money that he needs to raise, not just to remain in office, but also to pay dues to the party and raise the money that he needs, as I was mentioning earlier, to kind of move forward in the chamber. One study, a recent study by the Congressional Management Foundation, found that members of Congress are only spending about a third of their time right now legislating, just 1/3. Fundraising takes up a huge chunk of the remaining time. And again, that's because the system, as a result of Buckley v. Vallejo, of Citizens United, has just become completely distorted. And 50 years ago, that did not used to be the case, that members needed to dial for dollars at every mealtime and needed to raise so much money to get elected and to remain in office. And so when you talk to members who are leaving, and there's a quote in the book about this, they're saying that fundraising is a major reason, that just the drain of fundraising is a major reason that they're leaving. It sounds pretty miserable to me to not be able to eat breakfast without asking someone for money. And so I think that's a serious issue that we also have to think about when it comes to public, to attrition from public service, in a similar way that I was talking about with violence. With social media, nearly every member of Congress now has a social media account. And they understand that this is something that is, first of all, a great way to engage with constituents. And also something that, again, to my earlier point about the legislative power, when they get to Congress as freshmen and they don't have a lot of power to drive legislation, they can still be building a public profile, building public awareness about issues without ever having to touch a piece of legislation and become a social media star without really having a lot of kind of legislative power. The book talks about this as the dynamic of kings and prophets, kings who govern versus prophets with a megaphone. It's different kinds of power. And so members choose to do this to differing degrees and to lean into their king-making power or the prophet power. But certainly the pressure to, first of all, the lack of legislative power of many of them, paired with the pressure to raise money online constantly by creating a viral moment, is creating an incentive structure that has a lot of them convinced that it's worth spending a lot of time posting on social media and creating theatrical soundbite moments in hearings, I would argue, which is even more problematic. Representative Lauren Underwood, who I interviewed for the book, called this an incentive structure that is eyeballs and acclaim rather than substantive policy making. So again, the incentive structure, regardless of how much time members are choosing to spend on social media, the incentive structure is pretty distorted.
So our audience asks, does it seem like fear affects Democrats more than Republicans?
That's a tough question. I would argue that fear, if the question is referring to kind of fear of violence, that crosses party lines. In the study that we did at the Brennan Center, even of state and local lawmakers, we found that members of both parties were reporting incidents of violence. But actually in that study, we found that Republicans were more likely to say that violence had increased since they took office. And we know so many examples of Republican members, under threats and fear of violence, and Democrats with threats and fear of violence. I mentioned the Liz Cheney quote. There's this kind of similar quotes from Mitt Romney saying that members were afraid to vote for impeachment and told him this because of fear of violence for their families. We know that people like Adam Kinzinger, who are on the January 6th committee, just suffered a horrendous number of attacks. And we know from the U.S. Capitol Police that Democrats and Republicans both face just a tremendous and too high number of threats and attacks. According to the U.S. Capitol Police, between 2018 and 2023, the number of threats and incidents of violence against members of Congress doubled. And again, that's members of both parties. And the violence we know is also coming. This is research not from me, but from others. We know research shows that violence also comes from people with different political ideologies. So I don't think we can talk about this as a partisan issue. This is an American issue that is affecting constituents and representatives from both parties, and we need to approach it in a bipartisan way. And certainly in Congress, when it came to, for example, the issue of security stipends, that was a pretty bipartisan issue. Fighting back against political violence can be bipartisan, and I think we need to lean into that part of the issue.
And just to flag from your book also, you cite and quote Lisa Murkowski, who's a Republican senator, saying that she herself has had fear about taking particular positions because of the potential for political violence, and also that she knows her colleagues have as well. So, that there's example after example after example, I think, in your book and in the world that is influencing the actions of members of both parties today in a way that is incredibly distressing. Okay, we got our 5-minute sign, and I'm going to ask a last question. I actually have a last question. This is a penultimate question, but this is a Berkeley-specific one. In Berkeley, a young council member who was running for mayor dropped out due to harassment and fear for his family's safety. What do we do when our young, smart, up-and-coming public servants fear political violence? How can we rebuild a sense of safety and purpose in public life?
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's two avenues that we need to pursue. The first is our political culture that I was talking about earlier. Not normalizing this kind of violence. Us as a public, us as citizens saying this is not okay. We're going to show up and speak out against this. That's the first thing. The second thing I think we need to do is support members and candidates and potential candidates at every stage in their career. So there are wonderful pipeline organizations that are working to help get people elected, and again, particularly people who face greater hurdles to getting elected, and whether it's run for something that's about young people, or Higher Heights, that is a PAC that supports women of color running for office. These organizations are there, and I think that continuing to support organizations like this matters. And then when it comes to getting to Congress, we know that organizations like the Women's Caucus, or just organic friendships and mentorships, they help members to stay and to understand how to navigate things. There's a story in the book about Ed Blumenauer, who just retired. He used to, for over a decade, hand deliver a letter to new members of Congress about just advice on how to be a member of Congress. Now, I would argue that we need actual institutionalized onboarding. We shouldn't just rely on a kind member to deliver a letter, but it speaks to the kind of mentorship and support systems that we need. And we have this in so many other sectors of the economy, and so we need this in Congress. And so again, it's supporting people at every step of the way. I think particularly with the tremendous challenges that we know that people face in running and that people face in remaining in office. That, I think, is how we encourage more people to run and hopefully to win and to have a more representative government.
Right. So in our remaining minutes, I'd like you to give marching orders to this audience. What will we do? what's your hope that we will take away from your book and from your talk about how we will unstick our Congress and fix our democracy?
Well, I think, firstly, I want us to leave with hope. I want us to leave with hope that Congress is changeable, that it is stuck, and that we so desperately need to unstick it, but that in 1974, a wave of new members came in and changed dramatically the way in which Congress works, the way in which campaign finance and other major kind of veins of American politics were being reshaped in the 70s. In 2018, members came in and again changed things dramatically. This has happened. This can happen again. And so not losing hope that we can change our government, I think, is the most important thing at this time when I sense so much hopelessness around. I think that we can really draw hope and strength from the many lessons of reformers, at least I am inspired by them, who have come and who have changed Congress before. And the second thing is, again, just to say it again, I know we've hammered it a few times, is that we need to engage, that democracy is about a continuous conversation between members and their constituents. So often, I'm around people who care a lot about going out and canvassing or supporting a candidate, and that's great. But we can't just be voting for people and then be angry when the system isn't working.
Oh, the voting part too. Sorry.
We should be voting. We should be voting. And we should be voting in primaries and in general elections because we know that voting rates are even lower in primaries. Right. So we should be voting. But we should also be engaging with how we can support members the day after they're elected. And showing up and speaking out against things like political violence and speaking up for things like campaign finance reform and fixes like raising congressional salaries that members are terrified to do because their voters don't support it. We need to be doing this and continuously engaging in a conversation because we know that is how healthy democracies are formed. So that's what I want us to take away from this. And it is, the last thing I'll say is just that it could not be more urgent. And this part maybe people already know. It could not be more urgent. There is a 4-alarm fire facing our democracy. We're seeing Congress at a weaker point than it's been in many decades. And so it desperately needs our support. And we desperately need to figure out how to learn from the lessons of the past in order to make our government work better.
Maya Kornberg, thank you for your book. Thank you for your conversation.
Thank you so much, Catherine.